Good evening and welcome, everybody. It's good to see you here. I hope you are doing well and that you have had a good start to your weekend, wherever you may be, whatever your circumstances. Just while everybody's filing in, uh, I have had a busy week of academic meetings and job applications, and I'm really looking forward to just starting the weekend by discussing something that many of us really love, which is The Lord of the Rings. In particular, I'm going to focus on what might be called the climax of the plot, the episode or the part of it where the ring is destroyed. Spoilers alert. And discussing how that came to be, the exact way it happened in the books, which is a rather surprising turn of events compared to most stories, and go into some of the themes and influences that we find in it. And I thought this would be important as well because it's not something I've seen discussed very much, surprisingly. There's a lot of discussion about the world building that Tolkien did, various themes throughout the narrative, such as patriotism, the importance of hierarchy or kingship, the dangers of power, and so on, the dangers of modernity. But I see very little discussion of the actual climax of the plot in studies, whether that be academic or in on YouTube or in such places. So I thought that would be a really interesting uh, topic to discuss. Before we get into it, hello to CM Piano 2. Great to see you, and good afternoon, Fearless Leader. I guess you're in maybe in America or Canada, somewhere like that. It's good to see you both. I've been preparing for this stream by listening to Wishbone Ash in the last half an hour, and I've taken to listening to that music whilst playing Fall Guys. Have any of you heard of Fall Guys? It's a console game, which is you're like a little bean man, and you're in Takeshi's Castle or Total Wipeout, and you're playing against other people in real time, and it gets the blood pumping when you've got some great fantasy rock music playing that game. It's good fun. Uh, and I'll do a wee bit of shilling just now, just as people file in. So um, I've been away for a month or so. That was to do with some writing commitments and lectures. And I've got another lecture coming up, but I'm pretty much prepared for that. So hopefully, my new schedule is in place. And my plan is so people will know that Apostolic Majesty, whose channel everybody should subscribe to, on alternate Fridays, he runs the Ardanye streams on Tolkien's The Book of Lost Tales or the First Age, etc., etc. And the other Fridays are free within our spheres. There's not people often streaming on a Friday evening. So my thinking was over the next while, I will every 2 weeks, so on the alternative one from the Ardanye, I will do a live stream or a video starting this week. And then in 2 weeks' time, I'm delighted that the aforementioned Apostolic Majesty, his wonderful co-guest, Columba, and Shia Tori will be joining me for a discussion of the politics of the Skyrim Civil War, both the in-world politics of the game and its significance or symbolism in the real world of politics too. So that should be really great fun. Then in 2 weeks' time again, provisionally a history of dragon slaying, but I'll just need to see on that front whether it stays that topic because that was initially going to be this week, but it's such a vast topic. Almost every major European Asian culture has some kind of dragon slaying myth or story. So to go into the history of that is going to be quite some task. So it may be a future stream, and then in on May the 6th, so another 2 weeks after then, I'm delighted and over the moon that we can have a second That Hideous Strength stream. Uh, this is following on from the previous one a month ago, and one area of That Hideous Strength that we didn't touch on in that previous stream, which is so important to Lewis's novel, is that of masculinity, femininity, and sexual relations. These are a really key theme within that text, and Lewis has a lot to say on it, a lot of it which is very countercultural today, echoing many traditional Christian values, and it should prove a really fascinating resource for discussing these very prevalent questions that many of us are asking in this sphere. And to that end, I have got a great panel assembled. We have Radical Liberation, as always, but with him, Mrs. Radlib will be joining. So that will be fantastic, especially as they're starting to do more streams on male-female relationships and whatnot. We're going to have Amy gagging for lit back once again. And we're also going to have Mega Verma, or Classical Lit, as she's known on Twitter as well. And so the panel should they all, in their various ways, engage in these questions out with this book. So the book should provide a great source for that. So that's the next 3 streams or so after this one. And it should be, yeah, I'm really excited about it. So, oh, yes, it is pretty bright and colorful. And I mean, I guess it's really kind of pitched at 5-year-olds, but hey, it's super competitive. Those 5-year-olds are really good. I don't win very often. uh, yes. So on with the show. So as I said earlier, today we're looking at the failure of Frodo, or the climax of the Lord of the Rings, which is unusual because, in brief, most stories or fairy stories, the hero, of their own willpower, strength, and fortitude, overcome the villain in some way or another. Think of Saint George slaying the dragon. He does it. He succeeds. Or maybe something like the Marvel movies. Iron Man defeats Thanos through his ingenuity and quick wits. He develops the alternative Infinity Gauntlet and overcomes him. And maybe you could say the same about Harry Potter overcoming Voldemort. In The Lord of the Rings, at the climax of the story, Frodo Baggins, who was carrying the ring, fails in his quest. We'll get into the exact nature of that failure, but he is unable to throw the ring into the lava and destroy Sauron. That's a really interesting twist. Why does the protagonist fail in The Lord of the Rings? What significance does that have for Tolkien? And what were some of the influences on Tolkien in writing this? Indeed, when I say influences, it's important to note, and this is something that many of you will have come across in some of Apostolic Majesty's videos, that it wasn't so much that Tolkien was necessarily consciously thinking of a source when he wrote a certain part of The Lord of the Rings. It wasn't like he had Beowulf open in front of him and was reading it and then transmitting that into his text. Rather, he talks about his imagination being like a compost heap. He's read Beowulf, he's read the Greek classics, he's read Norse mythology, and all these things are swirling around in his mind and combining in new and exciting ways. And so when he comes to writing the story, it kind of emerges from this background. So there'll be allusions and resonances in places that he's not necessarily thinking of where it's come from, but it's bleeding through into the story. So that's the kind of way we're going to look at these influences. But why would it be important at all to look at The Lord of the Rings in this way? Why should we want to analyze it in a kind of philosophical or theological mode? What value is there in its presentation of certain ideas? Well, I think we can see this if we look at Tolkien's lecture and then later essay on fairy stories. Tolkien discusses a number of things to do with fairy or fantasy genre, both what constitutes it, its history, what its purpose is, and some of its kind of strengths and the gifts that it brings. And one of the reasons why Tolkien believes fantasy or the fairy story is so valuable is its ability to do what he calls recovery. He argues that oftentimes we are in danger of engaging with the world in a trite or overfamiliar way. We sort of reduce that which we once found wonderful and new and awe-inspiring, and it becomes something we cease to look at with joy. This is, in his view, emerges from a certain possessiveness. We appropriate something and make it ours to own, and in so doing, reduce its uniqueness, reduce its beauty and quality. We could see this perhaps as being akin to uh, greed in The Hobbit, or dragon sickness, as it's also called elsewhere. So there's this idea that a dragon. I think one of the dwarves explains this to Bilbo at the initial party in his unexpected party in Bilbo's house, that a dragon like Smaug, they love to hoard gold. That's one of their great desires. They'll bring it all together and they'll assemble a mound of gold and sleep upon it. But they have no use for this gold. They do not spend it. They do not work it into new and exciting objects. They don't even necessarily really treat it well or gaze upon it affectionately. They just have it. They just want it for themselves. And this, I think, you could also see perhaps with the dwarves later in the story. Thorin refuses to share his gold with the men of Dale and with the elves, although they have a fair case, at least the men of Lake Town, because of dwarves' actions, Smaug attacked Lake Town, so they have due kind of reason for asking for some reparation there. And Thorin refuses because he wants to possess all of this gold. He's not going to spend it. He just wants to keep it for himself. This is almost a symbol of what Tolkien's talking about on fairy stories. This idea that these things that we have or interact with, we just want to hoard in our minds and hearts without truly appreciating their otherness or valuing them in their own right. We could perhaps develop this by looking at somebody like Martin Heidegger's distinction between readiness at hand and present at hand. So for Heidegger, most of our knowledge is not, you might say it's not like objectified in a certain way. It's not like, oh, I go around the world and I think, what is a door? Or what is a chair? I don't come to learn about a chair through a kind of dictionary definition. Rather, I learn about something through how I use it. So take a hammer. Yeah, I could read about a hammer, but most of us learn what a hammer is by using it to hammer in nails. And for Heidegger, that is the source of most of our knowledge. It is in using things for various tasks. And we often don't even consciously think about what we're using. We just have a kind of instinctual or tacit knowledge that arises from engaging with a thing in its function. So, for example, you are probably watching or listening to this via a laptop or a phone. You're probably not even weren't even conscious or paying attention to the fact you're on a laptop or a phone until I mentioned that. Why? Because you're just using it. That's how you're engaging with it. But the danger with that kind of knowledge is that everything becomes reduced to how its meaning is determined by its functionality, how you're going to use it. And this contrasts with knowledge which is derived from present at hand, which is more like scientific knowledge, taking something and analyzing it in its own right, its properties. So you'll be looking at the computer and saying, what kind of elements is this made out of? What's its electrical structure? And so on. That would be more the present at hand. Maybe we could also think about this in terms of George Berkeley's idealism. So Berkeley was one of the British empiricists in the 18th century, kind of developing from John Locke and a precursor to David Hume. Indeed, he was very influential on Hume. And for Berkeley, all knowledge is derived from experience. And there are only two kinds of entity: that which perceives, so a perceiver, so you are a perceiver, I am a perceiver, we are beings which are able to perceive things, to apprehend things. And the other kind of reality is that which is perceived. There is nothing else in Berkeley's view. So in theory, when you see a door, the door is perceived by you, and therefore it is. But the question in Berkeley's empiricism is, well, if somebody doesn't perceive something, does it exist? So when the tree falls in the forest, without anybody being there to perceive it, does it exist? Does that event actually happen? Now, Berkeley gets the problem of saying, well, no, because there's no perceiver, in that he believes God perceives all things that are going on. So he could say, well, the tree falling in the forest is perceived by God, therefore it happens, it's a real event. But the point I wanted to make here is that this kind of view of reality, this sort of extreme idealism, could lead to a position where everything is defined or only exists in your world when you perceive it. As soon as it's outside of your perception, in a sense, it no longer exists. That would be, if there's no God, the logical extent of Berkeley's empiricism. And I think there's a similar idea with what Tolkien's talking about, with our possessiveness or appropriation. Something only, for many of us in our lives, and this isn't necessarily a completely bad thing, things only really have a reality when they're in our attention span. As soon as they leave it, we no longer are really aware of their existence. And in so doing, this leads to a certain flatness or shallowness to the things we engage with. They're just perceptions. They are just things which are perceived, which then fade into nothingness as soon as they're gone. I'll give you an example. So when it's raining, you'll be aware of the rain. You may not like it. Oftentimes we just define things by whether we like them or dislike them. But as soon as you're in the dry and you no longer think of that rain outside, it's gone. Unless you look out the window and see it again. And I think this is the issue with this, as Tolkien and we'll come on to what he says in a second more fully, is that it reduces the otherness of the world to just what we perceive. It defines everything in relation to our attention, our likes and our dislikes. Whereas actually we are but a small part of a great world filled with other beings with their own desires and values and motivations, with a whole planet filled with other life completely different from ourselves, operating in very different ways to how we operate. A tree is almost an alien in relation to human beings, and yet it seems so familiar. We lose our sense of the strangeness and magicality of something like a tree, something like a bird. For Tolkien, fantasy recovers some of that uniqueness by presenting the familiar, many often very simple things in a way we don't expect, and particularly emphasizing things we had forgotten, so we can see them as they are meant to be seen. So, for example, the tree. Well, in the Lord of the Rings, we have trees which can act as a threat. They can move. I'm not talking about Ents yet. So I'm thinking of Old Man Willow. His roots move and actually entangle hobbits. We have the trees of Fangorn Forest, which are actually able to move great distances when they would like. We also have the Ents, which are tree shepherds, but they're akin to the trees. They have bark, they have leaves and so on, and different species like oak and beech, but they have personality as well. Tolkien's kind of reminding us that actually trees have an existence in life other than ours, other than our attention span of them, through this kind of fantastical representation. We could say the same with mountains. Cahadras seems to actually want to repel the fellowship from crossing it. It could be also true of other people, and this can be seen in various species like dwarves and hobbits and elves. They have various characteristics that human beings have, accentuating them, maybe over exemplifying them. So fantasy is one way of recovering a sight of the otherness of reality, the difference, and allowing, I guess, encouraging a certain openness to allowing the world to impact us, and to have its own dignity and magnificence apart from just our feeling about it. It reminds us that there are things bigger than us, and we shouldn't box them in. Perhaps even the Hobbit as a whole is a kind of representation of this, in which Bilbo, who lives a rather comfy life, is whisked off on an adventure, and he learns that there's a lot more to the world than eating scones and frying bacon and enjoying the comforts of life. These aren't necessarily bad things, but he's got so boxed in that world that he can't really conceive of things more important, of things which have value beyond the comforts of home. It's also something that you can see with or another method of gaining this might be something like meditation. So there's a guy on YouTube which I'd encourage everybody to check out. He's not for everyone, but I think he's quite interesting. He's called John Butler. And he's been a farmer for most of his life, but he also has developed various spiritual meditative techniques. He's an Anglican guy, but he's more. I think he would affirm Anglican doctrine, but when it comes to meditation, he's quite open in his approach. And really, what he's interested in, because there's various forms of meditation in the Christian tradition and in others, but his is very much a focus of attention. So he would tell you to start by just you could be anywhere. You don't have to be in a silent place or anything like that, but just focus on the feeling of your feet on the floor, and just take like 10 seconds to just feel it, to experience what that feels like, to have something beneath your feet. It's something we aren't even cognizant of for most of the time. But Butler is pointing out that this is something we always feel, and we ignore it. And you can actually revel in it. You can kind of bend yourself into that feeling, and then you might start feeling the chair that you're sitting on, beyond what you're just immediately kind of physically in contact with. Maybe you might start paying attention to a particular sound. He wants you to to focus on one thing at a time. So maybe, and you're at a train station. I often do this at a train station, and you're just sitting there and just paying attention to the different sounds, and you'll be surprised at how many different sounds there are. You've got the people chatting, trains coming in and out, probably pigeons around, various kind of electronic noises, the wind or the breeze, and so on. And then maybe also what you see. So that wall over there, it's not actually one color. There's various shades of browns and yellows in it. The rail tracks, some have got rust on them, some are more shiny. You'll see the different colors of paint around the platform and so on. And so on and so forth. And what Butler's kind of bringing through this technique is he's reminding us that actually there is such color and life in the world beyond just its functioning, that you can actually enjoy these things as ends in themselves and not just reduce them to a certain flatness of our definition. They have their own value, they have their own otherness, and they exist whether we give them attention or not. So giving them our attention is a valuable thing. So there is value in discussing something like this, the climax of the Lord of the Rings, because it can have a similar effect to this meditative technique. It can show us things which we've forgotten or suppressed, and they're important truths about reality. Or that's at least Tolkien's argument. So that's a big preamble to the value of this, and I think there is great value in trying to recover some of these ideas which this narrative tells. And so what I'm going to do now is I'm going to read a couple of pages from The Lord of the Rings, which detail this climactic event in the narrative, just by way of context. So the main quest of the Lord of the Rings is to destroy the One Ring of Sauron, which, if it is destroyed, he will be defeated. There is no other way to defeat him properly. Force of arms is not going to prevail. They don't have enough soldiers to defeat Sauron's armies. You could defeat him if maybe somebody like Gandalf or Aragorn took the One Ring for themselves and used its power. But in that case, they would just become another Dark Lord. They themselves would become a tyrant. And Gandalf says at one point in the narrative that's what Sauron's banking on, that somebody will try that. But actually, they don't want any Dark Lord ruling over Middle-earth. They want to abolish all tyrants in that regard. So the only way to defeat him is to destroy the ring once and for all. And this can only be done in Mount Doom, which is in the heart of Mordor. And so the narrative follows Frodo and Sam trying to reach Mount Doom, Frodo being the ring bearer. And at this point in the narrative, the remnants of the Rohirrim and Gondorians who have fought in the Pelennor fields have decided to, under Aragorn's leadership, create a distraction. They're going to march to the Black Gate of Mordor, thus drawing Sauron and his armies attention that way, leaving the way to Mount Doom open in case Frodo is still able to reach it. And so these forces have very little chance of survival. They look like they're going to be destroyed. They're very quickly encircled, and it's only a matter of time. The only way they can be saved is if the ring is destroyed. If not, they will all die, and Sauron will take over Middle-earth. So that's the setting. Here we go. The path climbed on. Soon it bent again, and with a last eastward course passed in a cutting along the face of the cone, and came to the dark door in the mountain side, the door of Samath Nor. Far away, now rising towards the south, the sun, piercing the smokes and haze, burned ominous, a dull bleared disk of red. But all Mordor lay about the mountain like a dead land, silent, shadow-folded, waiting for some dreadful stroke. Sam came to the gaping mouth and peered in. It was dark and hot, and a deep rumbling shook the air. "Frodo! Master!" he called. There was no answer. For a moment he stood, his heart beating with wild fears, and then he plunged in. A shadow followed him. At first he could see nothing. In his great need he drew out once more the phial of Galadriel, but it was pale and cold in his trembling hand, and threw no light into that stifling dark. He was come to the heart of the realm of Sauron, and the forges of his ancient might, greatest in Middle-earth. All other powers were here subdued. Fearfully he took a few uncertain steps in the dark, and then all at once there came a flash of red that leaped upward and smote the high black roof. Then Sam saw that he was in a long cave or tunnel that bored into the mountain's smoking cone, but only a short way ahead out of which the red glare came, now leaping up, now dying down again, into darkness. And all the while far below there was a rumour and a trouble as of great engines throbbing and labouring. The light sprang up again, and there on the brink of the chasm, at the very crack of doom, stood Frodo, black against the glare, tense, erect, but still as if he had been turned to stone. "Master!" cried Sam. Then Frodo stirred and spoke with a clear voice, indeed with a voice clearer and more powerful than Sam had ever heard him use, and it rose above the throb and turmoil of Mount Doom, ringing in the roof and walls. "I have come," he said, "but I do not choose now to do what I came to do. I will not do this deed. The ring is mine." And suddenly, as he set it on his finger, he vanished from Sam's sight. Sam gasped, but he had no chance to cry out, for at that moment many things happened. Something struck Sam violently in the back. His legs were knocked from under him, and he was flung aside, striking his head against the stony floor, as a dark shape sprang over him. He lay still, and for a moment all went black. And far away, as Frodo put on the ring and claimed it for his own, even in Samath Nor, the very heart of his realm, the power in Barad-dûr was shaken, and the tower trembled from its foundations to its proud and bitter crown. The Dark Lord was suddenly aware of him, and his eye, piercing all shadows, looked across the plain to the door that he had made, and the magnitude of his own folly was revealed to him in a blinding flash, and all the devices of his enemies were at last laid bare. Then his wrath blazed in consuming flame, but his fear rose like a vast black smoke to choke him, for he knew his deadly peril and the thread upon which his doom now hung. From all his policies and webs of fear and treachery, from all his stratagems and wars, his mind shook free, and throughout his realm a tremor ran. His slaves quailed, and his armies halted, and his captains, suddenly steerless, bereft of will, wavered and despaired. For they were forgotten. The whole mind and purpose of the power that wielded them was now bent with overwhelming force upon the mountain. At his summons, wheeling with a rending cry, in a last desperate race there flew, faster than the winds, the Nazgul, the Ringwraiths, and with a storm of wings they hurtled southwards to Mount Doom. Sam got up. He was dazed, and blood was streaming from his head, dripped in his eyes. He groped forward, and then he saw a strange and terrible thing. Gollum on the edge of the abyss was fighting like a mad thing with an unseen foe. To and fro he swayed, now so near the brink that almost he tumbled in, now dragging back, falling to the ground, rising and falling again. And all the while he hissed but spoke no words. The fires below awoke in anger. The red light blazed, and all the cavern was filled with a great glare and heat. Suddenly Sam saw Gollum's long hands draw upwards to his mouth. His white fangs gleamed and then snapped as they bit. Frodo gave a great cry, and there he was, fallen upon his knees at the chasm's edge. But Gollum, dancing like a mad thing, held aloft the ring, a finger still thrust within its circle. It shone now as if verily it was wrought of living fire. "Precious, precious, precious!" Gollum cried. "My precious! Oh, my precious!" And with that, even as his eyes were lifted up to gloat on his prize, he stepped too far, toppled, wavered for a moment on the brink, and then with a shriek he fell. Out of the depths came his last wail, "Precious," and he was gone. So this is just a really beautiful passage and very tense. I should say that act of Gollum falling in is what leads to the destruction of Sauron. At that moment, Barad-dûr collapses, and the forces of Sauron are in complete disarray. Many of them also brought into the chasms that emerge. At that point, before we get into the nuts and bolts of the passage, I wanted to highlight one influence or possible influence upon Tolkien's portrayal here. And it's going to sound quite out of the blue at first, but hear me out. It is the story of Odysseus and the Cyclops, or at least how that story has been developed in over time. Certainly Tolkien was aware of this story and of later ones, including one that appeared in a book of fairy stories by Campbell was his last name. It was a Victorian text, I believe. And essentially, the narrative, which is common across many cultures, goes something like this. A hero goes into a cave, which is the home of a giant or a cyclops of some kind, and is captured. This hero blinds the giant in his one eye, and eventually escapes by hiding or riding on the belly of some creature, maybe a sheep or a goat, something like that, outwards, and the giant can't feel them. However, in later variations of this story, the giant then gives the hero a ring. And this ring, when it's put on the finger, cries out, "Here am I, here am I." And the hero cannot get this ring off their finger. And as it's crying out, "Here am I," the blinded Cyclops is able to find the hero. The only way for the hero to escape in many of these stories is to cut off his finger and throw it into the sea, so that the Cyclops goes into sea and drowns. So we can see that there's certain parallels here. There's going into a cave, that the enemy is a kind of singular eye of some kind, that this enemy has a ring which the hero possesses and can only be overcome by cutting off the finger or losing the finger and throwing it in. I am over here. Thank you. Subscribe to Vingle, which is, I'm sure Vingle's delighted that you have that name. I am over here. Yes. Yes, indeed, indeed. So this and throwing it into liquid, so the sea or into lava. So there's certain parallels there. It's not a perfect parallel. Tolkien likes to invert various narrative devices, but it's certainly one we can see in that. So Tolkien described in one of his letters Frodo's actions here as a failure. Not necessarily a moral failure. It's not as if Frodo was a particularly weak-willed individual in choosing to claim the ring as his own. He's not Gollum. He's actually, in Tolkien's view, the only person of his age of his time period, who could have taken the ring into Mount Doom. He's the only person with that willpower to have actually reached this far. Everybody else would have failed before this point. Rather, for Tolkien, it's more like being physically beaten. It's as if a stronger, quicker opponent defeated him in a duel. You wouldn't hold it against somebody for being beaten by a better sword fighter. In the same way, the ring, which is an active force, which is trying to break Frodo's will and prevent him from destroying it, defeats Frodo's will at this point. This is, in many ways, a very stark lesson that Tolkien's kind of presenting in the narrative here, which is that all would give in to such temptation. So, for example, Gandalf. We see earlier in the narrative that Frodo offers Gandalf the ring. He might be somebody we think, he's wise, he's good, he's a trustworthy individual, always does what's right, puts the good at the heart of what he's doing, trying to overthrow evil. But Gandalf absolutely refuses off the bat. He says, "This ring, I would use it for good. I would try to make the world a better place through this power. But in so doing, it would corrupt him. He would set himself up as a kind of overlord, trying to direct the world according to what he thinks it should be. Thus, he would fall to this temptation. He was aware that he would probably fall to this temptation. We can see this in the character of Saruman, the parallel here that Saruman has fallen for this. He just, when he asks Gandalf to join him, he talks about directing the world according to their knowledge and their order that they will bring. Although they will have to work with Sauron for a time, they will be able to overthrow him and then rule together using the power of the ring. It's not only the mighty, though, that have to worry about this power, or at least the wizards. So maybe somebody like Boromir. Boromir is a noble man. He is a warrior who fights against Mordor to defend his country. He wants to use the ring to overcome the forces of Mordor and make sure that his people are safe. But in so doing, he threatens to rob it from Frodo. He threatens to take the ring, which is not his to take. And at the same time, he also wants to use the ring to elevate his own position, to lead the free men of Middle-earth against Mordor, which is not his role. That's the role of the King of Gondor, Aragorn. He wants to set himself up implicitly as a kind of king figure. Even Samwise Gamgee, Samwise the Brave, would have fallen before Mount Doom. We can see this in two ways. One is that when he is given the choice, and this is probably the most. It's very noble in one way. He chose to go after Frodo rather than carry on the quest to destroy the ring. So love for his master would have been the temptation in one respect. On the other hand, he is also tempted to remake Gorgoroth into a beautiful garden. Now again, this is a wholesome desire. But at the same time, he would have given in to the power of the ring and not destroyed it. And in so doing, Sauron would have been victorious. So Frodo has done remarkably well to reach this point. But even he who could make it into Mount Doom, to stand on the very precipice of where it could be destroyed at the last, could not. In many ways, this is a representation of the Christian doctrine of original sin, particularly emerging in the Latin West, that all following the original sin of Adam in the Garden of Eden, eating the forbidden fruit from the tree of the knowledge of good and evil, all are both guilty of that sin, but are also in their faculties corrupted. They are predisposed towards doing ill, towards idolatry in various ways. And to this end, I wanted to read a passage from a book called The Forgiveness of Sins by Charles Williams, who was a fellow member of the Inklings with Tolkien. Often we think of Lewis and Tolkien as the main members, but Williams, who is a fascinating character, for a short time was also a member at the invitation of Lewis. He, unlike the others, he didn't have a formal university education, but he was just super well read. He spent his time reading Dante and such like, in part because he worked at Oxford University Press. So he had the good fortune of reading many great texts. And it was actually in reviewing one of Lewis's books that Williams was so moved by what he had read that he wrote to Lewis, who at the same time had been reading one of Williams's works, I believe. He was a great fantasy writer in his own right, and had a great love of Dante. But anyway, that's a for another day. He has a really interesting passage in this book about the nature of the original sin, and I'm just going to read a couple of paragraphs here. So much for the actual choice itself. I should say before I get into that, so what is this choice? For Williams, Adam and Eve only knew the good in the Garden of Eden. That is what God had willed. But they desired a knowledge of good and evil implicitly. And whereas for God, God can know what evil is just by knowledge of the good. He has that kind of counterfactual understanding, you might say. Human beings, our kinds of knowledge are those which we have from experience. Think back to what we were talking about, how for Heidegger, most of our knowledge comes through using things. It's through our experience of engaging with something that we come to know it. So if we are to know good and evil, we must experience evil. And in some sense, by experiencing it, well, you can only experience it if you've become evil or done something evil. So the very desire for the knowledge of good and evil, that choice which is in Adam and Eve, that desire to know schism in the universe, as Williams puts it, is the original sin manifested in taking the forbidden fruit. So that's the actual choice itself. But the making of that choice may have been single or multitudinous. We know so little of that high state which haunts us forever in our exile, and makes that exile preferable to us, and terrifies rather than encourages us with the hope of our return. It is not in mortal affairs alone that we can speak of hope that is unwilling to be fed. We know so little of it that its conditions are unimaginable. But I have wondered if indeed we were not all there, if all mankind was not then simultaneous and co-inherent, and whether all mankind did not then choose amiss. It would not, in fact, be more astonishing than that one should, or the choice of one may, in fact, have wrecked all. But Adam may have been our name as well as our single fathers, we in him and he in us, in a state other than sequence. We were in him, for we were he. We were all there, and we were all greedy or proud or curious. The original sin was in us, as we originally were. The co-inherent will of mankind moved, and moved against its divine original, which is the definition, so far, of sin. Either, then, we ourselves were in that state and there chose indeed, or, and this has been the more common doctrine in the Church, the state of man's co-inherence was then so intense that the whole original body was desperately affected by the act of its primal member. The description of the new creation in the epistle to the Ephesians is reversed, a description of the fall, that we may grow up into him in all things, which is the head, even Christ, from whom the whole body fitly joined together and compacted by that which every joint supplieth, according to the effectual working in the measure of every part, maketh increase of the body unto the edifying of itself in love, that we may grow away from him in all things. The whole body disjoined and decompacted decreases. The body was dissolved, or dissolved as far as could be, by the too effectual working of that which every joint supplied. So we have in Williams this idea of coherence, and I don't want to go too far into it because it's quite a messy and almost mystical doctrine. But it's this idea that, in some sense, human beings exist in one another. Williams gets this insofar as humans are in the image of God, and God the Father and God the Son are in one another, and the Holy Spirit too. And Jesus says, I am in my Father and he is in me. He takes this immediately from the fact that we all, for 9 months, are in our mother's wombs. That is our first coherence. But then moving beyond that, our needs are met by others. We are, in some sense, in others, and they are in us through this exchange, through our dependence, through the givenness of much of our life, depending on the activity of others. This then is applied to in the fall, and Williams is saying in some way our lives were mingled with Adam's, our wills were mingled with Adam's in some sense when he committed the original sin. We may even think of it in this way, and this is something I've been reflecting on quite a lot recently, that say Adam and Eve had not committed the original sin, and that through all of history there had been many people who had not sinned, but then it came to you. Well, in this view, each of us would have committed the original sin. We would have been that person. We would have done it. We would have been the ones who took the fruit, forbidden fruit. But it just so happens that we are all like that. We would have all taken the forbidden fruit in that position. And in some way, that is what's going on with Frodo here. He is the best of us, and yet even he took the ring as his own. Perhaps another analogy we could make here, beyond the biblical, is something which Jordan Peterson has kind of brought attention to. And he's not original in this point, but he's probably the one I've seen the most mentioning it. He talks about how often we have a sense when we look at things like the gulags or the Holocaust or genocides in Rwanda or all these kind of contexts, that, oh, we wouldn't have been involved in that. We would have seen sense and stood against it. Actually, his point is that most people wouldn't have. They would have gone along with it. And indeed, many of us have a monster inside of us who can't wait to be unleashed in the right context, especially when it thinks it's right. I mean, we can see this in our own culture with the kind of hysteria that's going on at the moment in many very, very different areas. There is a kind of self-righteousness which justifies doing immense evil to other people. And people are not aware that they're doing evil. They think they're doing the right thing. So this propensity in each of us, and it is there in the right circumstances where it is kind of validated, is also testament to this darkness that lies within the heart of human nature, or at least the potential for it. This fall of Frodo's follows the logic of the story. It demands it. The nature of the ring demands it, that it is too powerful to overcome by creaturely will alone. Indeed, we see this even earlier in the story, when Frodo initially is given the ring by Gandalf. And let me turn to the right passage. Sorry, he's not given it. They have their initial discussion about the history of the ring and what must be done. Gandalf's trying to explain to Frodo that this ring has a nature of its own, and it is almost impossible to give up. Frodo says at one point, "But why not destroy it? As you say, should have been done long ago," cried Frodo again. "If you had warned me, or even sent me a message, I would have done away with it." "Would you? How would you do that? Have you ever tried?" "No. But I suppose one could hammer it or melt it." "Try," said Gandalf. "Try now." Frodo drew the ring out of his pocket again and looked at it. It now appeared plain and smooth, without mark or device that he could see. The gold looked very fair and pure, and Frodo thought how rich and beautiful was its colour, how perfect was its roundness. It was an admirable thing, and altogether precious. When he took it out, he had intended to fling it from him into the very hottest part of the fire. But he found now that he could not do so, not without a great struggle. He weighed the ring in his hand, hesitating and forcing himself to remember all that Gandalf had told him, and then with an effort of will he made a movement as if to cast it away, but he found that he had put it back in his pocket. Gandalf laughed grimly. "You see, already you too, Frodo, cannot easily let it go, nor will to damage it. And I could not make you, except by force, which would break your mind. But as for breaking the ring, force is useless." So you see this already Frodo, in the context of his home in the Shire, is unable to give up the ring. Bilbo is only able to do it with great support from Gandalf. And indeed, I do think that actually follows from the logic of The Hobbit, insofar as one of the things that, as I mentioned earlier, is this love of gold, possessiveness of gold. We see it in a dragon, we see it in Thorin. It's initially part of Bilbo. It stirs in him in the unexpected party, but by being willing to give up the Arkenstone and his share of the gold to bring about peace, he overcomes this kind of temptation for towards possessiveness of wealth or precious things, and so he is able, with the help of Gandalf, to give it up. That's a very different matter from in the heart of Mordor. So Frodo couldn't give it up then. He was not going to be able to give it up in its most, in the context of pure darkness, without the help of the wizard. We might want to look at this quality of the ring as being influenced by a number of different kind of stories. I look at a couple of different sources here. So one is comes from Plato's Republic, and it is a passage in Book 2 of the story, of the dialogue, sorry, which is commonly called Gaiji's Ring. This comes in the context of Socrates and Thrasymachus have been debating the nature of justice in Book 1. Thrasymachus arguing that justice is nothing other than the will of the powerful. And Socrates seems to have handily overthrown the somewhat strident, preachy, and almost comical Thrasymachus. But then, having defeated him, one of our more erudite and thoughtful members of the group, Glauco, or Glaucon, wants to take up Thrasymachus's point of view and provide Socrates with a more almost steelman disposition that justice, well, we shall see. So I'm going to read you the passage here. It's a bit lengthy, but I think it really will help. So this is Glauco speaking. I said I was first to speak of, and hear what I said I was first to speak of, what justice is and whence it arises. For they say that, according to nature, to do injustice is good, but to suffer injustice is bad, but that the evil which arises from suffering injustice is greater than the good which arises from doing it. So that after men had done one another injustice, and likewise suffered it, and had experienced both, it seemed proper to those who were not able to shun the one and choose the other, to agree among themselves neither to do injustice, nor to be injured, and that hence laws begun to be established, and their compacts. And that which was enjoined by law they denominated lawful and just, and that this is the origin and essence of justice, being in the middle between what is best, when he who does injustice is not punished, and of what is worst, when the injured person is unable to punish, and that justice being thus in the middle of both these, is desired, not as good, but is held in honour from an imbecility in doing injustice. For the man who had ability to do so would never, if really a man, agree with anyone either to injure or to be injured, for otherwise he were mad. This, then, Socrates, and of such a kind as this, is the nature of justice, and this, as they say, is its origin. And we shall best perceive that these who pursue it unwillingly, and from an impotence to injure, if we imagine in our minds such a case as this. Let us give liberty to each of them, both to the just and to the unjust, to do whatever they incline, and then let us follow them, observing how their inclination will lead each of them. We should then find the just man, with full inclination, going the same way with the unjust, through a desire of having more than others. This every nature is made to pursue as good, but by law is forcibly led to inequality. And the liberty which I speak of may be chiefly of this kind, if they happen to have such a power as they say happened once to Gyges, the progenitor of Lydas. For they say that he was the hired shepherd of the then governor of Lydia, and that a prodigious rain and earthquake happening, part of the earth was rent, and an opening made in the place where he pastured his flocks. That when he beheld and wondered, he went down and saw many other wonders, handed down to us in way of tradition, and a brazen horse likewise, hollow and with doors. And on looking in, he saw within a dead body larger in appearance than that of a man, which had nothing else upon it but a gold ring on its hand, which ringing took off and came up again. That when there was a convention of the shepherds, as usual, for reporting to the king what related to their flocks, he also came, having the ring. And whilst he sate with the others, he happened to turn the stone of the ring to the inner part of his hand, and when this was done, he became invisible to those who sate by, and they talked of him as absent. That he wondered, and again handling his ring, turned the stone outward, and on this became visible. And that having observed this, he made trial of the ring, whether it had this power, and that it had happened that on turning the stone inward he became invisible, and on turning it outward he became visible. That perceiving this, he instantly got himself made one of the embassy to the king, and that on his arrival he debauched his wife, and, with her, assaulting the king, killed him, and possessed the kingdom. If, now, there were two such rings, and the just man had the one, and the unjust the other, none, it seems, would be so adamantine as to persevere in justice, and dare to refrain from the things of others, and not to touch them, whilst it was in his power to take, even from the forum, without fear, whatever he pleased, to enter into houses and embrace any one he pleased, to kill and to loose from chains whom he pleased, and to do all other things with the same power as as a god among men. Acting in this manner, he is in no way different from the other, but both of them go the same road. This, now, one may say, is a strong proof that no one is just from choice, but by constraint, as it is not a good merely in itself, since everyone does injustice wherever he imagines he is able to do it. That every man imagines that injustice is, to the particular person, more profitable than justice, and he imagines justly, according to this way of reasoning. Since if anyone with such a liberty would never do any injustice, nor touch the things of others, he would be deemed by men of sense to be the most wretched and most void of understanding. Yet would they commend him before one another, imposing on each other, from a fear of being injured. Thus much then concerning these things. So, Gaiji's ring is similar to the One Ring in that it gives the power of invisibility. And Glauco is arguing that anybody who possessed such a ring would, given that they could escape the consequences of their actions, would do those things that are generally deemed immoral, but they're of to your own benefit, such as, well, in this case, he's described raping, killing, etc., etc., stealing. We see this with the creature Gollum in The Hobbit, who is rather mean and doesn't have aspirations to rule the world, but rather in his caves in the mines of Moria, he slips on the ring now and then to go and hunt down a goblin, murder it, and take it back to eat. When he loses his ring, he's fearful of the goblins. He won't do it anymore because he knows that he might be caught and killed. He's only willing to do it because he's invisible. And there is a sense that perhaps this is the great temptation of the ring, that it allows people to act in ways where their actions, whether they're right or wrong, typically wrong, they'll be able to overcome their opponents. So Saruman with the ring will be able to impose his will upon Middle-earth. Boromir with the ring will be able to elevate himself to the heroic king, as it were. Sam will be able to make Gorgoroth. They'll have the power to do this without facing the consequences of their actions, or at least that's what the ring wants them to believe. We all know it's a rather deceptive and tricksy thing. Yes, Julius Flavius, it was goblin imps, but it also talks of goblins more generally as well. It kind of goes backwards between the two. That's a whole other discussion. How do goblins have kids? That'd be it's a kind of scary prospect. But anyway, we can see this idea emerging once again with Friedrich Nietzsche, that actually what most people call morality is in fact a cover for cowardice. That many people who will feign virtue, say they're doing something for virtuous reasons, are in fact just afraid that if they did what they wanted, they would be punished by the law or by others. And actually, it's very rare to find somebody who genuinely acts out of duty or obedience, sincere kind of belief that this is the right thing to do. Perhaps even in our own experiences, we kind of know that when we're when we can, we might fudge the rules or take a shortcut we shouldn't if we can get away from it. Take a cookie from the cookie jar when nobody's looking, and so on and so forth. This is one of the temptations that the ring has for our heroes, and it certainly does for Frodo. And in that moment where he can destroy it, or he can take this power for himself, anybody, at least for Glauco in this passage, would take it. It's in human nature. Of course, the rest of the dialogue, Socrates is trying to argue that there is justice is better because it is the just soul is the whole soul. It's the one that is it is the one that can contemplate the forms, and then thus it has a virtuous goodness to it in itself. And that also translates to society, which is ordered according to justice, with the different levels of people ordered in such and such ways. So that would be one form of influence here. The other, perhaps another significant one, comes from Norse mythology, and that is, of course, Andvaris Ring. And I'm going to read a couple of passages here. These are from a book called Viking Myths and Sagas, retold from ancient Norse texts by Rosalind Curven. I have no knowledge of how good these translations are, so I apologize if there's people in the chat who know the originals languages and think this is an aberration. But it tells the story pretty well. So the first passage comes from the Prose Edda, and it details the kind of origin of Andvaris Ring, Andvari being a dwarf. Odin immediately sent Loki into the land of dark elves. There he found the dwarf Andvari, who had taken the shape of a fish in the water. Loki caught him in his hands and threatened to kill him unless he paid a ransom of all the gold that he kept in his cave. So they went to the dwarf's cave, and Andvari brought out all the gold he had, and it was great riches. The dwarf tried to conceal one small gold ring under his hand, but Loki saw it and ordered him to hand it over. The dwarf begged him not to take this ring, saying that if he kept it, this ring would produce new wealth for himself. Loki answered that the dwarf could not keep anything, and he seized the ring from him. However, as he went out, the dwarf cursed the ring to bring death and ruin to everyone who ever possessed it. So we see here that there's a creature in a cave with maybe a little lake, and he has a ring. So this sounds a lot like Gollum, and this ring is actually able to produce wealth, which is maybe different from the One Ring in some respects. But it also comes with a curse of bringing death and ruin to all who ever possess it. And there is a sense in which the One Ring has this characteristic too. It's never ever, there's not the same curse on the ring in that way, but it does seem that anybody who possesses it is going to inflict a terrible toll upon, and they usually end up in terrible ways. Ilúsador dies, he is killed. Gollum becomes this wretch who ends up burning in lava, and even Frodo, he is never the same after the events. But we'll come to that. So then, what happens with this ring? Well, here's the next part of the story. There was a man called Hreidmar, a sour-faced old brute, who kept a farm out on the edge of the wilderness with his 3 sons. No wife was ever seen there. The men had fallen into rough ways and sordid habits. Sometimes the sons dabbled in magic. One night, 3 strangers came knocking at Hreidmar's door. One was beardless and smirking. The second was striking and very tall, but shrouded in silence. The third was an ancient greybeard, wrapped in a vast dust-coloured cloak and a wide-brimmed hat that completely concealed his face. "What do you want?" growled Hreidmar. The greybeard answered, "A place to sleep for the night." Hreidmar looked them up and down. "I don't hand out free hospitality." The smirking one poked him with a sharply manicured finger. "We wouldn't dream of asking you to," he said. He held up his bag enticingly. "We can pay you well, with food. We passed a waterfall on the way here, and the hunting around it was excellent. I caught a fish and some meat, both in a single blow." "All right, then," said Hreidmar grudgingly. "You can come in." They followed him into his hall. Hreidmar fetched his drinking horn, filled it parsimoniously with weak beer, and handed it around. Then he said, "Right, let's see what you've brought." The smirking one opened his bag and drew out a fat, oily salmon. Hreidmar nodded his approval. Then the smirking one winked at his companions and pulled out a dead otter. Hreidmar stared at the animal. The colour drained from his face. He let out a strangled gasp. His fingers clutched the air, then flew to his belt and grabbed his sword. "You murderers!" he screeched. "That otter isn't an ordinary animal. It's the transmuted form of my own son." He stepped forward, seized the smirking one by the hair, and held the sword blade to his throat. "You killed my son, you scumbags." At that moment, an inner door burst open, and two young men rushed in. "Fafnir!" cried Hreidmar, foaming at the mouth. "Regan, these rats have just slaughtered your eldest brother. Remember how Otter changed in his animal shape this morning to go fishing? Well, they stoned him dead, without any provocation, in cold blood. Even worse, they conned their way in here with Otter's body, and they're trying to trick us into eating him. Help me take revenge, boys. Let's kill them in return." Fafnir and Regan raised their fists. Hreidmar made to lunge at the strangers with his sword. But before he could strike, the old greybeard suddenly bellowed, "Stop!" The word hung ominously in the air. For an instant, the greybeard's hat shifted, and they glimpsed a hole where one of his eyes should have been, and the other eye sunken like a dark, fathomless well. "Be still," he said. "Listen. We are not what we seem, Hreidmar, not mortal men like you. We are gods. You won't find it easy to kill us." The three men froze. Sweat ran down Hreidmar's face. His hand began to tremble. Slowly he lowered his weapon. At last he said hoarsely, "I don't care a bull's turd who you are. If I can't kill you, I want proper reparation. A decent payout of blood money." "How much?" said the greybeard. Hreidmar looked wildly around, then snatched up the dead otter and slashed it open with his sword. The flesh slithered out in a pool of blood. "Enough gold to fill this whole otter skin. No more, enough to cover it as well." The greybeard nodded slowly. "You shall keep two of us hostage until you have it," he said. "Meanwhile, my companion here, Loki, will fetch it right away." At the name Loki, the three men blenched. They stared at the smirking one, then turned to the one-eyed greybeard with horrified shudders of realization. Loki yawned and stretched lazily. "Right, All-Father, I'll be off. Don't worry, Hreidmar, you'll get exactly what you deserve." Then, smooth and quick as a snake, he slipped away. They waited a long time. When Loki returned, he came staggering and clutching his shirt, which bulged and rattled. He lifted its hem carefully and let a pile of fat gold nuggets drop from it onto the floor. "Here you are," Hreidmar. "Where'd you steal this from, trickster?" said Hreidmar. "Steal? You've got cheek. This is a gift. Andvari Oinson gave it to me. Very fitting, because just like that son of yours who we killed by mistake, he's a shapeshifter. Andvari was pretending to be a fish, but I easily flushed him out from the underground pool where he was lurking and coaxed him to turn back into a dwarf. We had a little chat, and he agreed to give me this." He started stuffing the nuggets into the otter skin. Once it was full, he stood it upright and used the rest of the gold to cover it. "There," he said, "all done." "No, it's not," snarled Hreidmar. "I said the gold must cover the corpse completely, but there's still an end of the whisker showing." Loki clapped his hand over his mouth apologetically. "So sorry. What a shame I've got no more nuggets to give you, Hreidmar. All I've got left is this." He reached into his shirt, pulled something out, and held it up. The very last bit, Andvaris Ring. The ring gleamed exquisitely in the lamplight. Hreidmar's eyes widened. "You can take it if you really want to," said Loki. "But let me give you some advice. Don't. I didn't offer it initially because, well, you know how risky dwarf smithing can be. This ring's got a dangerous curse on it. It's doomed to destroy anyone who wears it." "You liar," said Hreidmar. "You're just trying to cheat me. Give me full payment." Loki shrugged and flicked his fingertips carelessly. The ring dropped onto the pile of gold. "So," he said, "is our debt settled?" "I suppose so," growled Hreidmar. "Now get out." Hreidmar shuddered, snatched up the ring, and thrust it onto his finger. "So," he said to my sons, "I did well out of that little adventure." Regan said, "But you've only got this gold because those brutes killed poor Otter." His father stroked the ring. "All that weird shape-shifting he went in for, that boy was asking for trouble." "Even so," said Fafnir, "we'll miss him." He cleared his throat noisily. "Now, father, how about our share out? Otter was our brother as well as your son, so we're entitled to some of the blood money." Hreidmar's face darkened. "Entitled? Share out? How dare you?" "Give it to us, or I'll fight you for it," roared Fafnir, and he began to slash about his father with his sword. Hreidmar was no coward. Quickly he drew his own sword and fought back. But despite his harsh words, he couldn't bring himself to harm his own offspring. So it wasn't long before Fafnir had won the fight, and his father Hreidmar lay dead. "2 of our family killed in a single day," said Regan. "This isn't good." Fafnir shrugged and snorted. "Don't waste any grief for him, brother," he snarled. "All our lives he was a rotten, heartless father. He never gave us anything." He squatted down, forced the ring from Hreidmar's stiffening finger, and pushed it onto his own. "What a fine piece of jewellery." He tapped the ring against his teeth and grinned. "Well, I'll just pack up the rest of the gold, then I'll be off." "Hold on," said Regan. "You're not taking it all. I'm entitled to half of it." "Why? What have you done to win it?" said Fafnir. "If you want some of this gold, you'll have to fight for it, like I did." Regan fingered his sword nervously, then backed away. "You pathetic mouse," said Fafnir. He turned to the pile of gold. He fetched a sack and quickly shoveled the whole lot into it. Then he opened the door and strode out. So after this part, Fafnir eventually turns himself into a dragon, and he has this ring, and he keeps growing. The gold keeps growing, and he develops this mound of gold. And Regan will hire Sigurd to slay this dragon in a manner not too dissimilar from the way Turin Tudumbar will slay Glaudung the Black. But that's another story. The point that we have here is that there is a ring which produces great wealth, and as soon as people wear it, they themselves become possessive and insular and want to, well, and rather selfish about it, and those who from the outside become very envious of this, and they may say seemingly good things like, "Oh, we are brother, our brother died, so we should get some of the blood money too." But it's actually a cover for intense jealousy and envy, and this is very akin to the effect that the One Ring has on people. That as soon as they come into its presence, it's a temptation not to take this ring. Sorry, it's a temptation to take this ring. That it almost sparks a yearning within a character to have it for themselves. I've been watching a lot of Breaking Bad recently. I didn't watch it when it first came out, so I know I'm a decade behind. But hey, if I'm behind the current times, I think that's a good thing. And one of the things that really struck me about the character of Walter White is initially he wants to get into the game of making meth because he wants respect, he wants money, and so on to pay for his medical treatments. But there becomes a point in the series, I can't remember which one, but I think there's a few times this comes up. There's various points where he can feasibly get out of the game. He doesn't need to make any more money. He's paid for all of his bills. He's achieved what he wanted to do. But rather than quit, he goes back into it. And it's not necessarily to make more money. It's not necessarily to gain more respect. It's because there's something about it which he really enjoys, and it's that feeling of power and domination and control. He loves that. He relishes it, and so rather than quit, he goes on and makes more more meth. There's a set. I think this is, and if we wanted to connect it to Gaiji's ring, part of the whole kind of premise of the show is that he's able to do this without facing consequences most of the time. But he has to scramble around in various ways to prevent people from finding out, from his wife to his brother-in-law, who's a member of the DEA, the drugs squad, and kind of it's him trying to wrestle with that, keeping in that state of he can do this evil thing, which gives him great pleasure, without facing the consequences. So I think these two sources of Andvaris Ring and Gaiji's Ring can be clearly seen in the way that the One Ring is a temptation and kind of plays on human nature's innate capacity to pursue that which is unjust when it is profitable for us, and this kind of madness overcomes us when it is presented to us. It's a kind of irresistible force that we see with Hreidmar and Fafnir and so on. And if we wanted to connect this with politics in some way, don't worry, not rank punditry, we might look to Thomas Sowell's identification of the constrained vision or tragic vision and the unconstrained vision. The constrained vision, in Stoll's view, is that which underpins conservative or right-wing political philosophies, which is the idea that human beings are fallible and that they can never reach a state of perfection. And as such, human nature is tragic. It is always going to fall in various ways. Thus, when we are developing a society or thinking about how it should be constructed, it needs to exist to constrain human evil. It needs to aim to limit the amount of evil somebody can do in office, for example. I mean, we even heard Glauco mention that laws exist to constrain injustice rather than promote justice, as it were. And this, in theory, as far as I understand it, I have a limited knowledge of this, but in theory, the American Constitution, with its division of powers, is meant to aim towards this constrained vision. At least that is Sol's argument. By contrast, the unconstrained vision, which Sol attributes first to Rousseau and to much progressive politics, is the idea that human nature is inherently good, and its goodness or perfectibility is being oppressed by various structures, societal structures. These hold us back. These are the chains which prevent us from reaching a utopia. And so what needs to happen in society is that we need to overcome these obstacles. We need to change the systems. We need to break those chains open and reorder the way we relate to one another. And once those are in place, those proper systems, human beings will be free and perfect, because by our very natures we will be. So this is an unconstrained vision. And we could see this in progressive politics today, in the attempt to rewrite for almost every aspect of our cultures and our societies, undoing customs in the name of freeing people from oppression. What we see with the One Ring and kind of Frodo's fall is that for Tolkien, human nature is tragic. And so there's an implication that perhaps a political settlement needs to be one of a constrained vision rather than unconstrained. Because when we give unlimited power, like the One Ring, to any individual, they will fall for it. They will give into it. And this, in part, I think, it kind of answers a typical objection you see to so one event that I think's in the films. I'm not sure it happens in the books exactly in this way, but there's a moment where Isildur is on the edge of the crack of doom, where he could throw the ring in, and Elrond's shouting at him, "Destroy it! Throw it in the fire!" And Isildur doesn't, and then walks away. And people say, why didn't Elrond just kill Isildur and throw it in himself? Well, the obvious answer is he could have killed Isildur if he was able to. He could have, but he would have taken the ring himself. He would have broken too. This also answers the question, well, what about the eagles? Why didn't the eagles fly Frodo to Mount Doom in 15 minutes? And then they could just drop it in the top and the whole saga be over. But this, of course, misses the obvious point. The ring would have tempted the eagles. They would have taken it themselves. I stand corrected. Thank you, Julius Flavius. So it is there. But yeah, any character who will be contributing to this quest would be tempted to take the ring. The eagles would not have allowed it to be destroyed. They would have tried to take it for themselves. So there's this kind of myth that there's a kind of forgetfulness about the power of the ring in the story. But actually, it's so alluring. It so moves us. It's a kind of medieval, early modern view of the soul, that objects move us, they change us they're like matches which spark something within each of us, and we are magnetically drawn or repelled by them. This is Aquinas's view of the passions. The ring has that quality, like it did for Hreidmar and Andvaris Ring. And so these ideas that, oh, there could have been a shortcut to destroying the ring, it's absolutely nonsense within the logic of the story. So then, let's move on to the next kind of section here. We've discussed a lot about the power of the ring here in this story, but it's interesting the choice of words that Frodo uses when he takes the ring as his own. And let me get the right page open again. There'll be a lot of backwards and forwards within this text. I've got one of those the big ones where all of the books are put in together with the appendices. It's a lovely quality a combination of the Lord of the Rings. It's great. It's awfully heavy for taking on the train, but it is very, very, very nice. Let's see. I should have written this down somewhere. Sorry about this, folks. Nearly there. So he says, I have come, but I do not choose now to do what I came to do. I will not do this deed. The ring is mine. At the heart of this, I do not choose. This is a free choice of Frodo's. And this reflects, I think, a really important theme within the whole of The Lord of the Rings, that of free choice. It's a series of, everybody's thrown into a series of scenarios, and they have to, taking responsibility for their own actions, decide what is the best course to take. It's laid firmly on them. There's a lot of junctures where there's different roads ahead, and they have to take one. They have to decide to take one. Gandalf puts it very well in this initial discussion, which really sets a lot of the kind of streams that come from the rest of the story. So Frodo, he's just been tried to destroy the ring in his fire, and he was unable to throw it in. And then he says, I do really wish to destroy it. Or, well, to have it destroyed. I'm not made for perilous quests. I wish I had never seen the ring. Why did it come to me? Why was I chosen? Such questions cannot be answered, said Gandalf. You may be sure. I think I'm reading the wrong passage here. My apologies, folks. Where did he say it? He says something to effect that it's not for us to decide what circumstances we're in. Here we are. I found it. My apologies. I wish it need not have happened in my time, said Frodo. So do I, said Gandalf, and so do all who live to see such times. But that is not for them to decide. All we have to decide is what to do with the time that is given us. So there is that sense that although we are not responsible for our environment, for our circumstances, for the evils that afflict us, these are other beings which are doing these things, we are responsible for how we respond to it. Indeed, Gandalf will say later that we have a duty to remove that evil only which is in our own time. We are not responsible for future or past evils, but we are in how we engage with this one. We see this element of rational, deliberative choice in many places, such as the Council of Elrond. This is not many books would have a chapter devoted to a meeting discussing the possible options about how to respond to the One Ring. Indeed, there is another chapter later, the Last Debate, where Gandalf, Aragorn, and a few of the leaders of men discuss what course of action they should take then. This is a very key theme for Tolkien, that characters, they're not just victims of their circumstances, and they cannot blame their upbringing, their background, their society, or even their desperate circumstances. They have to take a choice about what they ought to do. We see that somebody like Denethor is kind of presented as having neglected his duty to stand up to the forces of Mordor and throwing himself into despair, a lack of hope, ending in his death. We see also in somebody like Gollum, the argument is made that he's a rather mean character, very wicked even before he took the ring, and thus it was very easy for the ring to tempt him to commit murder and to kill Deagle. For Charles Williams, Charles Williams asks a question in this book on forgiveness about what do we mean by willing? We often talk about, free will, making choices. And in the modern kind of conception, maybe it's a post-Kantian idea, there is a sort of independent agent who exists in a kind of vacuum, who has a kind of a will, a bit like a clock hand, which can point one way or another. And so this agent, in some ways, is detached from their choices. At least this is how you end up with a situation where people can do heinous things, but say, "Oh, but I'm a good person. I'm not bad." That you often see that in our society, and it's this idea that your moral actions are somehow independent of what we do or who we are. For Williams, our will is not some kind of clock hand, but rather to will something is to become something. We become X. So for Adam to will to know good and evil, Adam becomes evil in the Garden of Eden, or experiences evil. We see this in this idea in the Lord of the Rings. Gollum wills to become a slave of the ring. He thus becomes that, and it's reflected in his deformed body, the way that he's changed. We see it with the ring race. They will to become servants of Sauron, and in so doing, they lose their own physical form and are reduced to invisible spirits who dwell in darkness. And in some sense, we see this with Frodo. He chooses to become a ring lord rather than to destroy the ring. There is this sense that what you will is what you are. And this we see this. So these examples of Gollum and ring race are quite extreme, but we can see this in the real world actually. So if somebody chooses, we might say, to be greedy, to eat lots, well, we see this in their bodies, right? They become overweight. If they choose to eat very little, they become very skinny. This could be more subtle than just these sorts of things, though. Like, so if you want to identify yourself with a certain set of ideas or culture, maybe kind of hipster, let's say, maybe you get a nose ring. Maybe it's the clothes that you wear, etc., etc. So social justice warriors will often have a certain kind of haircut, and maybe their hair dyed in a certain way. Maybe they wear certain clothing. Uh, the very fact that there could be such stereotypes indicates that there's a certain way of presenting oneself. But that's a choice. They've become that way. Now, of course, these choices are moved by very powerful forces. We've seen that the ring can elicit very strong desires for it. But that is still a choice to become something else. through the ring. So this idea that choice is a big factor plays out there. And then when Sam wakes up, having been knocked out by Gollum, he sees Gollum wrestling with Frodo. Well, he can't see Frodo because he's invisible, wearing the ring, but Gollum is wrestling with him, like a mad thing, the text says, which I think is a great little phrase. And I think that there could be here an influence of a passage from Genesis. So Genesis 32. Let me get to the right passage. And Julius Flavius, I see you're saying Samwise cannot be corrupted. Oh, yes, he could, my friend. He would have given up. He would have failed at the very end, like all. At least that seems to be the logic of the story. So, let's see. So in chapter 32, and from verse 22, Jacob is preparing to meet with his brother Esau, and he's quite worried about this because he robbed Esau of his birthright. He deceived Isaac, took his birthright, and Esau vowed revenge. So this is a rather nerve-wracking moment for him and his family. But then something happens in the night just before he's going to meet Esau. That night, Jacob got up and took his 2 wives, his 2 female servants, and his 11 sons, and crossed the ford of the Jabbok. After he had sent them across the stream, he sent over all his possessions. So Jacob was left alone, and a man wrestled with him till daybreak. When the man saw that he could not overpower him, he touched the socket of Jacob's hip, so that his hip was wrenched as he wrestled with the man. Then the man said, "Let me go, for it is daybreak." But Jacob replied, "I will not let you go unless you bless me." The man asked him, "What is your name?" "Jacob," he answered. Then the man said, "Your name will no longer be Jacob, but Israel, because you have struggled with God and with humans and have overcome." Jacob said, "Please tell me your name." But he replied, "Why do you ask me my name?" Then he blessed him there. So Jacob called the place Peniel, saying, "It is because I saw God face to face, and yet my life was spared." The sun rose above him as he passed Peniel, and he was limping because of his hip. So we see in this, and I should say after this, Jacob meets Esau and they are reconciled together. There is no bloodshed in this passage. We even read Esau ran to meet Jacob and embraced him. He threw his arms around his neck and kissed him, which, just reading it there, sounds very like the father of the prodigal son. Does it not? But anyway, so Jacob wrestles this man, which he takes to be God after this passage, and the man damages Jacob's hip so that he'll always have this limp, and gives him a blessing. And there is this sense that although Jacob was able to hold his own, it was only by losing something, by being injured in some way, that he could receive the good gifts or grace of the Lord. There is a parallel here with what happens with Frodo and Gollum, of course, though it's not a direct one-for-one. It never will be with Tolkien. But Frodo wrestles with Gollum for the ring. Gollum bites Frodo's finger off with the ring on it. It is through this that Frodo is delivered from his fall, because by taking the ring, the finger with the ring on it, Gollum, in his elation, falls to his death. We'll come on to a bit more of that in a wee while. But the point here is that Frodo, in some sense, by losing his finger, that sinfulness in him, that desire for the ring, is excised with his finger. Blessing comes in that respect. He is delivered. Sauron is defeated. His fault is overcome. And then even after this, he is known as Frodo with 9 fingers, or of 9 fingers. So there is this sense that Frodo has been renamed, just as our good friend Jacob here has. And perhaps Frodo's lesson, in some way, is that he has to learn mercy. But before I come on to that, I should say as well that there is a similar giving up or wounding of the self with the story of Odin, in that he gives up one of his eyes to drink from the well of Mimir, and through doing so receives great knowledge and wisdom. So again, we see this pattern of, in some sense, bodily disfigurement, losing something of oneself to gain greater knowledge or blessing, to gain salvation, perhaps. So what is the exact nature of Frodo's? Well, I think it is to learn mercy or pity. This is kind of his great narrative arc. We see near the beginning of the story, again in this great conversation between Gandalf and Frodo, that Gandalf explains that Gollum has been captured by the enemy and has revealed that somebody called Baggins has the ring to Sauron. Frodo says as follows: "But this is terrible, far worse than the worst that I imagined from your hints and warnings. Oh, Gandalf, best of friends, what am I to do? For now I am really afraid. What am I to do? What a pity that Bilbo did not stab that vile creature when he had the chance. Pity? It was pity that stayed his hand. Pity and mercy, not to strike without need. And he has been well rewarded, Frodo. Be sure that he took so little hurt from the evil and escaped in the end, because he began his ownership of the ring so, with pity." "I am sorry," said Frodo, "but I am frightened, and I do not feel any pity for Gollum." "You have not seen him," Gandalf broke in. "No, and I don't want to," said Frodo. "I can't understand you. Do you mean to say that you and the elves have let him live on after all those horrible deeds? Now at any rate he is as bad as an orc, and just an enemy. He deserves death." "Deserves it? I dare say he does. Many that live deserve death, and some that die deserve life. Can you give it to them? Then do not be too eager to deal out death in judgment, for even the very wise cannot see all ends. I have not much hope that Gollum can be cured before he dies, but there is a chance of it, and he is bound up with the fate of the ring. My heart tells me that he has some part to play yet, for good or ill, before the end, and when that comes, the pity of Bilbo may rule the fate of many, yours not least." So, in that respect, Gandalf is rebuking Frodo for his judgment of Gollum, that he's a character that deserves to die, and for his evil, and also because he's a threat. He's been a threat to Frodo, and has revealed where he lives. He's frightened. He wants to kill his enemies. I mean, in many respects, we've been hearing in our circles for a long time about the friend-enemy distinction, and that you should desire the absolute destruction of your existential enemies. This is a passage which may, in some ways, be challenging to that narrative. That maybe pity is, at least for a character like Gollum, what ought to be given. And so later, when Gollum catches up with Sam and Frodo in Emin Muir, they manage to capture him, and they have to decide what they're going to do with him. They agree that if they're going to kill him, they have to do it outright. But then, as Frodo is thinking about this, he hears the conversation we've just heard, but with a slightly change in what Gandalf says. Deserves death? I dare say he does. Many that live deserve death, and some die that deserve life. Can you give that to them? Then be not too eager to deal out death in the name of justice, fearing for your own safety. Even the wise cannot see all ends. Notice the difference there in terms of uh, don't be eager to deal out death in the name of justice, fearing for your own safety. Gandalf's calling out that Frodo talks of justice about what Gollum deserves, but really his desire to kill him emerges out of fear. And so it's an unjust act. It's a cover. So in that respect, so following that, Frodo decides to spare Gollum and make him promise to serve him. We'll come on to the importance of that very shortly. But we can see then that it's Frodo's decision to show mercy towards Gollum and to trust him and let him guide him to Mount Doom, which is the precondition for the destruction of the ring. If Frodo had killed Gollum at this point, not only would he have never made it to Mount Doom, he wouldn't have found the secret stair and the tunnel to get there, but also he would have taken the ring for his own. Sam probably, his love for Frodo would be so great that he could never have tried to kill Frodo and push him in or anything like that. It's only because Gollum's there, Gollum with his ravenous love for the ring, that means that he's able to, that the ring is taken from Frodo and thus destroyed by Gollum's own delirious joy at having the ring, stepping too far. So this is it's Frodo's mercy which allows for this, and we see this carried through to its completion after these events. So his finger's been taken, the ring is gone. He's lost any of that kind of judgmental character that he used to have, and so when it comes to this scouring of the Shire, we see that Frodo, unlike the others, does not get involved in the fighting, continually asks the hobbits not to kill any, if they can avoid it, especially any hobbits. And when Sharky, the fallen form of Saruman, tries to stab Frodo and he fails to kill him because of the mithril shirt, Frodo, even then, says do not kill him, but shows him mercy once more. So this is the full completion. We've gone from a character who, out of fear, wished the death of Gollum, to a character now who, even when he's actually assailed by another character, will show them mercy where he can. He's no longer frightened. Perhaps this is also a reflection on his own failing. He recognizes that he is also a character who has failed. And he is a character who, like them, who needed mercy. He has made a similar mistake. He took the ring for his own, which could have jeopardized the whole future of Middle-earth. Indeed, it should have. It should have been the victory of Sauron over all free peoples. So he is just as reprehensible in some ways. Perhaps we don't know for sure. He doesn't tell us the inner workings of his mind, but that could be part of this. That he removes this idea that he is good and they are bad, and can see that actually he is also guilty, perhaps of something worthy of death. But he has been spared. We also see that the ring may have been a player in this too. So the ring is an active force, as we've said, and Gandalf explains that the ring chose to leave Gollum in the Mines of Moria, and it has the power to leave its owners, its masters, when it feels it's convenient. And I mean, it's not said in the text, but it could have been that although Frodo had taken the ring for his own, the ring, seeing that Gollum was there, well, he knows Gollum is not going to try and destroy the ring. Frodo has tried, so it's probably much safer to give it for Gollum to have it once more. So we could see this as a sense that the ring has left Frodo for Gollum in this moment. And as Julius Flavius has just said, it did so with Isildur in the river. So we have to see this as a potential avenue as well. We also have to see that there is a curse or an oath which is also being fulfilled here. So when Frodo decides to show mercy to Gollum, they have an elven rope around him, and it burns him so badly that Frodo says, we will take this off you if you are able to give us an assurance or a promise that we can trust you to keep. Then if you can do that you won't attack us and whatnot, then we will take this off. And Gollum promises, if I can get to the right page, he offers to swear on the precious, on the ring. Now, Frodo corrects him and rebukes him, saying, it is treacherous and it may twist your words. And he also tells him to swear by the ring. And Gollum promises, I will serve the master of the precious. Good master, good Smeagol, Gollum, Gollum. And that he won't harm him in any way. And this is by the ring. And Frodo, in a later passage, when Gollum is somewhat... Smeagol's trying to help at this point. They're at the Black Gates, and he doesn't want them to go in that way because they'll be captured and he'll never get the ring back. But he tells them about another way into Mordor, and he's trying to persuade them. At this point, Smeagol had even said, just give me the ring and you guys can go back. So already it's coming back again into his... the desire for the ring is worming its way in, even while he's got good intentions. And Frodo kind of brings himself up. He's got a look and tone that of somewhat sternness and greatness. I did not mean that danger that we will share. I mean a danger to yourself alone. Frodo's addressing Gollum here. You swore a promise by what you call the precious. Remember that. I will hold you to it, but it will seek a way to twist it to your own undoing. Already you are being twisted. You revealed yourself to me just now, foolishly. Give it back to Smeagol, you said. Do not say that again. Do not let that thought grow in you. You will never get it back. But the desire of it may betray you to a bitter end. You will never get it back. In the last need, Smeagol, I should put on the precious, and the precious mastered you long ago. If I, wearing it, were to command you, you would obey, even if it were to leap from a precipice or to cast yourself into the fire. And such would be my command. So have a care, Smeagol. So we see here that there is a curse that Frodo's, or a prophecy that Frodo's suggesting here, that actually, if Gollum breaks his oath, then he would be cast into fire. Well, this most definitely happens, does it not? And I mean, one could conjecture that perhaps this was Frodo's will, or perhaps even said this, but it's never said explicitly to Gollum at that moment, and he fell into the fires. I mean, the ring was still on his finger at that point as well. So is he still the master of the precious? Perhaps. But this ties into the idea that oaths are not just trite little sayings or promises in the world of Middle-earth. They have power. When you make a promise in that world, it is binding by something akin to natural law. And to break it is something which leads to bitter ends, as Frodo said. We see this in The Hobbit, actually, with Gollum and Bilbo. They play the riddle game, and the kind of promise that Gollum makes is if he wins, Bilbo gets to be eaten. Doesn't sound like a very nice offer, but if Bilbo wins, Gollum will show him the way out of the mines of Moria. Now, Gollum loses, perhaps on an unfair riddle. What is in my pocket? It's not really a riddle, but the ancient laws of riddling, of the riddle game, should not be broken because they have the same quality that they must be fulfilled. Gollum breaks his promise. He tries to eat Frodo or eat Bilbo, but unintentionally leads Bilbo to the way out of the mines of Moria. Bilbo's invisible, wearing the ring, and he follows Gollum in the right direction. So there's a sense in which the promise that Gollum had made was such that it actually changed reality, so that when he failed to uphold it, when he lost the riddle game, he still showed Bilbo the way out. In the same way, Gollum's promise to Frodo is broken, and the prophecy is thus fulfilled, that he is cast into the fire with the ring. Completely beyond his intention. So this is another element. This is another player almost another agent. We've got Frodo, we've got Gollum, we've got the ring, we've got the oath. But then there is perhaps the mastermind or the real source of what's going on here. I'm going to return us to a passage again from Gandalf and Frodo. It's just littered with so many wonderful points that work their way through the rest of the narrative. And it's one that will be well known to many of you. I just need to find the right page here. So the fact that Bilbo found the ring is what they're talking about here, and that the ring left Gollum. It is no laughing matter, said Gandalf, not for you. It was the strangest event in the whole history of the ring so far. Bilbo's arrival just at that time, and putting his hand on it, blindly in the dark. There was more than one power at work, Frodo. The ring was trying to get back to its master. It had slipped from Isildur's hand and betrayed him. Then when a chance came, it caught poor Deagle, and he was murdered, and after that Gollum, and it had devoured him. He could make no further use of him. He was too small and mean, and as long as it stayed with him, he would never leave his deep pool again. So now, when its master was awake once more and sending out his dark thought from Mirkwood, it abandoned Gollum, only to be picked up by the most unlikely person imaginable, Bilbo from the Shire. Behind that, there was something else at work, beyond any design of the Ringmaker. I can put it no plainer than by saying that Bilbo was meant to find the ring, and not by its maker. In which case, you also were meant to have it. And that may be an encouraging thought. We'll see later in this conversation that Frodo will talk about, why was I chosen? This idea, it wasn't just luck. It wasn't a fortuitous event that the ring came to Frodo. Actually, this was something that was intended by some kind of power. Indeed, Elrond, when discussing the calling of the council, talks about how all of these people, such as Boromir, Gimli, Legolas, they all came to Rivendell seeking counsel from Elrond on matters related to the ring, but without any knowledge of the others going. And they all arrive at precisely the time that is required for a meeting about how to respond to the threat of the One Ring. This event he describes as being called, though not by me, and that it has been ordered in such a way. When Frodo, of his own free choice, decides to, to offer himself as the ring bearer, Elrond talks of him being appointed to this task. Nobody appointed Frodo within that council. We also see this in the events of The Hobbit. For example, when the dwarves get to Rivendell, they show Elrond a map. And it just so happens that they show him the map on the exact day, an exact season, when the moon letters on the map can be seen, which really helps for the rest of the quest. And the same is also true of when they arrive at the Lonely Mountain. They arrive at the right time to enter by the side door. The whole of these narratives are filled with fortuitous coincidences all the way through. But the interpretation of Gandalf and Elrond is that these are not just by chance, they're not just random, they're not just extreme miraculous luck. These have been intended by a personal hidden agent. Now, for those of you who have read the Ainulindale, you will know that this power is Eru Iluvatar, the One or the All-Father, who is the creator of Middle-earth and all beings within it. It is said within that narrative that the free actions of the Ainur in the music that they make, including those of Melkor, which is rebellious music, is actually an instrument of Eru Iluvatar's, that they have their origin in Eru Iluvatar. These are the beings and their actions have been imagined by Eru Iluvatar, and that they are instruments towards his design, to what he's intended for Middle-earth. It's not the place here to go into the mechanics of that. There's different interpretations within Christian traditions. But the fundamental idea there is of providence, that Eru is the guiding hand behind all that happens in Middle-earth, good and bad, towards an intended outcome. And perhaps a really helpful comparison here or analogy is with is kind of suggested by Tolkien. Tolkien describes Iluvatar at various points in his letters as the author or the writer of the story. The idea of an author is interesting here. So an author, if we're going to think about this in terms of providence and free choice, an author imagines the characters and all their actions within a story. They direct everything that takes place. Everything is according to their design. However, within the world of the story, the author, though present on every their presence is felt on every page and every action that takes place. Within the story itself, the author does kind of construction of this world doesn't undermine the freedom of the characters within it. It doesn't undermine the events that take place, of having their own dignity and value. Because within that world, these events arise from the nature and choices of these characters. This is the relationship Eru has with the history of Middle-earth in the main. So in the whole of Lord of the Rings, you don't see Eru as a character as such. He is rather the author of the entire story, of all the events that happen, to tell a narrative that he wants to be told. There are only a few times where Eru himself is a character acting within the story, and that can be seen in the Ainulindale, the events with Aule and the creation of the dwarves, and perhaps as well with the intervention of the what's it called? I'm having a mind blank now. Somebody will tell me the of Numenor, the drowning of Numenor. There's only a few occasions where he enters in to the narrative. These are interesting in terms of the relationship between an author and their role as a character within a narrative. Does that break something? We can also think about in the Christian tradition, the idea that God is providential, but then also becomes a character within the world too. We might say in the incarnation, in particular, this idea that God, the author of all, is also present as an actor engaging with other actors. It's not a perfect analogy, but that would be another way of thinking about it. So let's take this destruction of the ring then. The destruction of the ring is an event intended by Eru Iluvatar, and all of the events which have taken place in the Lord of the Rings, good and evil, are his means for achieving this story. So the mercy of Frodo, well, first of Bilbo and then of Frodo to Gollum, this is an instrument towards it. The then failure of Gollum to reform and to repent when he has the opportunity is a part of this. The failure of Frodo to destroy the ring is an instrument here. And then the ring itself trying to tempt Frodo is part of this. Gollum returning and trying to take the ring and then falling to his death is the final part. So there's all of these preconditions and all of these factors which Eru, by creating these creatures with their own histories and cultures, and in all the interactions that they have with other people, has developed this story to make this happen. So why this version of events rather than another for Eru? Well, it relates to Tolkien's concept of eucatastrophe, which he defines in his lecture on fairy stories. The eucatastrophe kind of narrative arc is, for Tolkien, the essence of the fantasy genre. And it's this idea that your characters will reach a point where they are faced with the prospect of ultimate defeat, that they're at the brink of annihilation by the enemy. They are beyond their own powers to redress them, and this should arouse despair and hopelessness. This is something that we see in a character such as Denethor. He's reached a point of hopelessness and can see no way of defeating Sauron. And at this moment in particular, where Frodo takes the ring for his own, seems like absolute catastrophe, that Sauron has been victorious, all of Frodo's friends fighting at the Black Gate have died for nothing, and tyranny is going to reign forevermore, because the ring will be returned to Sauron in due course. However, the eucatastrophe rather than catastrophe is that at that moment of ultimate defeat, grace comes in. There is a miraculous, unlooked for deliverance, usually by an external power, and it's never looked for to recur again. We see this in something like the Battle of Helm's Deep. I have a video on this channel which kind of goes into that more fully, where the characters like Aragorn and Theoden, it's looking pretty bleak. The Uruk-hai look like they're going to win, but then Gandalf arrives with Rohirrim, with Erkenbrand, and they are delivered. They are set free, and this arouses great joy and elation, both in the characters and in the reader. It's a wonderful feeling of absolute excitement and just it's a great kind of the twist of the twist. So this is a narrative arc we will see throughout the whole of The Hobbit and The Lord of the Rings. This idea that something acting outside of our understanding or apprehension, when all looks lost, will come in and rescue us. So Gandalf rescuing Bilbo and the dwarves from the trolls is such an example here. Bilbo takes this role on himself in The Hobbit. Using the ring, he rescues the dwarves from the spiders. It's a kind of eucatastrophic moment. I've mentioned the Battle of Helm's Deep. We can see this also in this episode here, but less explicitly than those, because that a character delivers the eucatastrophic moment. But here, it is providence. It is providence which achieves this. Frodo has taken the ring for himself, but the other power has so ordained it that by Frodo's mercy, Gollum would be present at this event. And that Gollum would, in conjunction with the ring leaving Frodo, would get the ring, and in his absolute joy of having it, in his possessiveness, thinking back to the idea of possessiveness we were discussing earlier as the bane of true openness to the world, Gollum's possessiveness would be so much that it devours itself and flies off into the lava below. This is the story that Eru has ordained to take place. And so it is a eucatastrophe that he wanted to achieve. He wanted to destroy the ring through the mercy of Frodo, and in such a way that it would take this arc. Tolkien himself mentions this because it's not explicit in the text. You can't see a passage, oh, and this is what Eru meant. But in one of his letters, he talks about how Frodo had done his best. He had got the ring to this point, but he had fallen, and then the writer of the story, by which I do not mean myself, takes over. So the way Eru had constructed all of these parts to fit together, there was going to be deliverance. And this idea, there are two kind of things emerging from medieval Catholic thought, which are underpinning this understanding. One is the notion of the happy fault, or felix culpa. So this idea is that Adam's original sin in the Garden of Eden was actually, on balance, a good thing. Why is this, you might say? Well, it allowed for the redemption of humankind by the incarnation, by Jesus Christ, which brings glory to God in the mode of salvation which is offered to humanity through his condescension to human form, through his crucifixion and resurrection, but also that the restored state, the redeemed state, is of a higher standing than the original one of creation. There is greater joy, greater love for God, greater thankfulness. So this sin of Adam is, as a precondition for the incarnation or of redemption, is a happy fault. It is a felix culpa. In the same way, Frodo's failure in this view is a felix culpa, because it is the precondition by which his prior mercy can be used by Iluvatar and to create this eucatastrophe. If Frodo had thrown the ring in himself, it would have been an act of will on his part, which had achieved it. But because he gave in to its power, which anyone would have, then it was then Eru gets the glory for bringing grace, and mercy is shown to be the means by which he operates. The other Catholic idea, I should say, felix culpa gets carried over into many of the Western Christian traditions. John Milton famously in Paradise Lost has a passage which Arthur Lovejoy famously wrote an article on, saying it was a Felix culpa analysis. But the second thing is a distinctively late medieval theological idea which retains itself within the Catholic tradition, and that is of the Pactum. Now, the Pactum is an idea which emerges in the Via Moderna or Via Moderna. In the late medieval university system, it wasn't like today where you can take a number of modules or courses across subjects, and that these subjects are not within a consistent tradition. They're kind of abstracted bits of knowledge that you learn. No, when you went to university back then, you would typically go and learn within a particular theological tradition. You could learn from the Via Antiqua or Antica. So this is the old way, and this would either be the school of Aquinas, so Thomism, the Dominicans, or of Duns Scotus, which would be the Franciscan way. So these were the two old ways. However, a newer school had emerged, the Via Moderna, the new way, typified by figures like William of Ockham or Gabriel Biel. And this was a rival approach. And within this school or movement, there had developed a new understanding of justification, or a new articulation, maybe. And this is the idea of the pactum, the pact that God had made with humanity as to the nature of salvation. The pactum, in essence, is as follows. God had decided that to repute certain things as a condition for justification. That is, quod in se est. If one does their best, then, though their best is not worthy of merit in itself, God will deem it worthy. And as such, when one does their best, God will meet them with grace. This can also be seen in the idea of, or the sacrament of penance, especially as it emerges or is changed during the Catholic reform, Tridentine reforms, and so on. In penance, one is to confess their sins to a priest, and under the reforms of Cardinal Borromeo, one had to perform various acts of penance, such as giving to charity, certain prayers, maybe abstaining from certain activities, before one could be absolved. So one had to do their best. One had to be contrite in thought, word, and deed before one could be forgiven, before grace can come in. This is also, I think, something we can see with Frodo. Frodo does his best. He takes the ring to Mount Doom, to the heart of darkness, and as Tolkien himself interpreted it, this was not a moral failure, but he gives into the power of the ring because it's just stronger than his will. But having done his best, then Eru Iluvatar, to quote Tolkien, takes over. He gives grace. So there is a similarity here with the Pactum, or the sacrament of penance, I think, and it's very apt because Tolkien himself thought that this event, Frodo's failure, is an embodiment of the two lines in the Lord's Prayer: "Lead us not into temptation, but deliver us from evil." This kind of sense within the prayer that we don't want to be tempted, but when we are, we will need deliverance by the Lord. So that is part of it too. And the Pactum is really important because not just in Catholic theology, but that understanding of salvation is that which Martin Luther, as a monk, embraced, and it's what he reacted to. He changed. In his view, the Bible doesn't teach that pact, but rather in his understanding, the pact God has made with humanity is that if one has faith, then God will step in. So the condition to do one's best has been replaced by to have faith, and then God will give justification or give grace, etc., etc. So that is a number of ways that we can approach this this passage in the Lord of the Rings. I think we've covered the nature of human nature, the way in which temptation can overpower us, and the desire to do what is not right can be activated in us when we gain power. We've looked at the roles of oaths in Lord of the Rings. We've looked at the importance of free choice. We've also explored the role of providence in all of this. And this is all within the context of recovery, as we said at the beginning, that this is a way of showing us again true things about the world that we may have forgotten in some way or another. That we may be, through a passage like this, be reawakened to the role of providence within the real world. We may be more attentive to how mercy and pity might actually be the means by which the Lord operates in this reality, and may be the way to victory, indeed, if history is a series of eucatastrophes. So that is what I've got at the moment. I wanted to leave a little bit of time for comments and questions, and I'm just going to have a look. I'm going to go right to the beginning of all the comments. I see there's been a lot, and I'm really pleased about that. But feel free to type some things in there if you've got any points you wanted to raise or anything that you wanted to ask about, and we'll take it from there. So, hello again to CMP. I know I saw you've got a bit of a cough, so I'm really sorry to hear that. And I really hope that you get well soon. We'll be thinking of you. You say you've never played Skyrim, so this is from reference to the stream. I'll shill a bit later. Hello, Julius Fabius. I've seen you've been commenting, and that I've really enjoyed your engagement. This must have been talking about how it's unusual to see a hero defeated in the fantasy stories. And yes, old Beowulf gets destroyed by the dragon. He does slay the dragon, though. I think that's an important distinction for Frodo. Frodo doesn't succeed by his own will. Beowulf dies. Beowulf is killed by the dragon, but he himself kills the dragon. So that is a little different. It's probably more like Turin Turambar, I think. That's probably a closer analogy. Because he kills Glaurung, but and then he kills himself. So maybe not. Maybe not. It's something that's going to come up in the Ardania, so we'll be exploring that, I'm sure. Greetings, Vingle. Good to see you, and I hope you've seen that you seem to have somebody shilling for you, a subscribe to Vingle account. I hope you are very pleased. Hello, James Avenue. Really good to see you, and I'm really delighted that you've tuned in. I'm glad that my voice is giving you some ASMR. People have told me that in the past. Yeah, and I hope you've enjoyed the stream as well. And evening to you, John Boy. Good to see you. Good to see you. I've been enjoying chatting with you on Twitter now and then. So yeah, really good to see you here. Yes. So this was in the passage we were looking at, how Sauron's will is, well, as you say here, the directing force, and how as soon as it's lost, as you say, Cowardice overtook them all. And I do wonder if this is maybe a little lesson for all of us today in some way, that when that central directing agency is taken away from a certain movements, they lose their power. I think, for example, of BLM. We have not seen them for a long time now. And it seems that that's because the elites in our society have decided to move on from that. They're not important now. They're not being directed by the Democratic Party, for example. So I do think that's a really important point, and maybe something to think about. How do you remove that then? Or is there certain ways we want the elites to be directing? Just like, so, the battle at the Black Gate, that's an attempt to distract, isn't it? So maybe there's value in that. Maybe we shouldn't just be taking them head on, but kind of in a Sun Tzu, the art of war, deceive your opponents, get them fighting on a front that actually isn't our main front, perhaps. Yes, great song, great tune. Let's see. Oh, good to see you, Lady of Shalott. I'm so glad you were able to join tonight. I've always been trying to find a good time that you can actually watch live, so I hope this is the one. I hope this is going to be good. Many of you will know Lady, but she is the mother of all of our chats, and it's just great to have around. Just a great person, really. Same goes for Apostolic Majesty. Everybody should subscribe to his channel. I definitely don't have a vested interest in that, but he does great history streams, great Tolkien streams. I believe he was also on a stream recently with Charles Colum again about Tolkien. So definitely check that out if you get the chance. Those two together are always great. Let's see. Gnawing on Frodo's will for months by now, plus the 70 years. Yes, exactly. So this isn't just something that, suddenly at Mount Doom it tempts him. It's been tempting him for a long time and he's been resisting it. I don't know if any of you have ever had a temptation which is constantly acting at you or constantly afflicting you, and you're trying really hard not to give into it. It's a really horrible experience. It's really painful and really hard to overcome. So I guess addiction would probably be a really good example of this. People who are addicted to drugs or to alcohol, or these days, it could be porn or video games or whatever it is. It takes extreme measures to overcome. No contact, often. Well, imagine if you're a recovering alcoholic and you have to carry this bottle of wine with you for 17 years and then for months, and then you end up in a kind of vineyard or something. It would be that's the equivalent here, I suppose. Yes, and then this is the point I was making, that even they would give in to the ring. Nobody is free from it, from its influence, or would be able to resist it. There is Tom Bombadil. He is the one person I've not mentioned, and I don't intend to go any further into that because that's a whole question about who is Tom, what's his business, and that should be a stream on its own right. I do not feel I could answer that in this moment. Is this something to do with the egoic effect versus divine providence? I think I've kind of come on to the divine providence thing, so I'll move on from there. Yes, that is true. It's this, and you see this with Aule as well, with the creation of the dwarves. There's this kind of idea that sub-creation, as Tolkien would say it, is always at risk of ending in a will to dominate and to possess. This idea of possessiveness keeps coming back in Tolkien, when actually this isn't to possess a creation which isn't actually one's to possess. This has its roots in Tolkien's ideas of the very nature of creation. All things have the beginning in the imagination of God, including the Ainur, who are the offspring of his thought. This is an idea that he, we see it in George MacDonald, who Tolkien was an avid reader of. So I do think there's influence there. So the artificer is always at risk of doing this, of being possessive of that which is not theirs to be possessive of, and thus reduce its beauty and magnificence to their own shrill tune. Let's see. I appreciate there's a lot of comments here. What I'm going to do is I'm going to move to the ones that probably came after I invited some. Let's see. Sorry about your cough. I don't think you need to apologize. It's something I've been thinking about recently. It's actually one of the great things about live streams, is that people. It's not even necessarily the stream itself often, which is the main thing, but that is part of it. It can be something in the background, perhaps, but oftentimes it's just those conversations in the live chat too that make it. Depends stream to stream. It's the advantage over something, but then you can also interact with the speakers. So it's something which is you should never feel you have to apologize for on this channel. It's a great thing, and I think it's one of the great advantages of live streaming over a video. Although I think the videos have their own strengths, and it's also the advantage of compared to a premiere, I think, as well, that just the whole event is organic and live in that respect. Top 3 Wishbone Ash tracks. Front Page News. I don't think it's necessarily one of the best songs, but I cannot get that tune out of my head. It's so good. And I've just been going around singing it all the time. Blowin' Free. Again, I'm not sure it's one of the, technically one of the best, but I just love that song. And then, there's so many. I'm going to say Warrior. Can't go wrong with Warrior. Yes, well, so this returns to the point that Sauron directs his orcs, but when they cannot help him in this moment, they're completely forgotten. The orcs are useful idiots, I suppose. Let's see. Yes. So I was saying at the beginning that basically Apostolic Majesty typically streams Ardanye on a Friday every other week. And so I checked the calendar for when he's doing that, and I've scheduled my streams or videos to be those weeks he's not streaming them. So there shouldn't be a clash. It should actually be complementary and maintain a weekly cycle of related content. So that should work for the time being anyway. You are back. You are back. You're supposed to say "I'm here" or something like that. I hope you get well soon, pal. Whatever you have. Let's see. Yes, community experience. A weird online ragtag of a fellowship. A fellowship. That's the word I'm trying to say. Yes. I'm not going to sing it though, I'm afraid. So just giving folks a few more minutes to make any comments or questions you might have. But before while I give you a chance to do that, just an update on the next couple of streams. So as I was outlining at the beginning, I'm hoping to do streams every 2 weeks, or videos every 2 weeks, on a Friday around this time. Some flexibility. It wouldn't be any earlier than 9 p.m. British time, but for reasons which I'll come on to, there may be some movement. So, the next video on this channel is going to be a live stream featuring Apostolic Majesty, Columba, and Shire Tory, and we are going to be discussing the Skyrim Civil War, in particular, the politics of the Skyrim Civil War. Now, I am assured by my guests, my three wonderful guests, that there is going to be a lot of lore discussion. We're going to be discussing what are the actual politics of it, not just within Skyrim, but for the whole of Tamriel, going back eons. It's going to be great. But we're also going to be discussing perhaps historical influences that Bethesda drew on for creating the Skyrim Civil War, and its political significance today. What kinds of broader narratives does it symbolize? Or what kinds of ideas are embedded? What kind of political philosophies are articulated by the Stormcloaks and the Imperials and the Thalmor, etc., etc. So it's going to be jam-packed. I don't know how we're going to get through it all, but we will do our best. So that is going to be in 2 weeks' time on a Friday around this time. Then another 2 weeks after, I am going to do a solo stream or a video. It could be on dragon slaying. That was my initial plan for today, but researching it, it's just such a mammoth topic that I may need to either divide it into parts, or it might just not be feasible at all for one person to do. It's because almost every major culture has had a dragon slaying myth or story very central to it. And these develop over time in lots of very interesting ways and have very significant meanings, and interesting things to explore. But just to get even a handle on it, it's difficult too, because when I prepare for these streams, I like to prepare stuff which I feel I can speak with some confidence on, with some authority. Maybe that's reading secondary literature and so on, or maybe watching some other people's content and thinking about it. But because of the vastness of the dragon slaying stuff, to get a handle on even one story, it will take quite a while. Never mind thousands of years worth of dragon slaying stories and all the developments. So I think we'll need to see. It could be something else. Another idea I have for that Friday is I've been really thinking a lot about the academic agent's idea that culture is downstream from politics. And I'm not totally convinced that that's the whole story. I'm not convinced he necessarily thinks it's the whole story in some of his other comments. But I don't think politics is also just downstream from culture. I think there's some missing elements here which need some articulation and some exploration. So that could be an alternative. But then there will be 2 weeks after that, so May the 6th, there's going to be a very, very big stream. And that is the follow-up to That Hideous Strength. So part 1 was a month ago. If you haven't seen it, I'd love it if you checked it out. That stream featured Radical Liberation, Apostolic Majesty, Amy, i.e. Gagging for Lit, and Luke from Lambda Bible Studies, and we discussed primarily the political philosophy and historical influences on that hideous strength by C.S. Lewis. But one aspect of the book we did not engage with in any great detail was a really significant portion of it, which is how it treats gender and sexual relations within the text. Lewis presents a strong critique of modern ideas about masculinity, femininity, and romance, and presents a traditional Christian point of view. And so I really felt, to do justice to the book, we need to look at this part, and so that's going to be the emphasis of the second stream. And I'm going to be joined by a somewhat altered panel this time. Last time, bringing in people who, particularly in the things that they've mentioned or said in their writings or videos, focus on gender and sexual relationships. So we're going to have Radical Liberation on again, but he's going to be joined by Mrs. Radlib. So that's going to be great. We're going to get the two of them together, and I think it's particularly nice given that they are embarking on doing more videos to do with the roles that men and women take in relationships, in parenting, and so on. So this book will provide a great kind of resource for discussing many of the themes that they're talking about and have a lot of wisdom on. We're going to be joined once again by Amy, Gagging for Lit, a star of Women's Hour on AA's channel. And she also has her own channel where she does book reviews. She's not done many, but I encourage you to check it out. Go and support her. And she has some good things to say on some of those books. And I think this was an area of that hideous strength, because we were just chatting about it. That was the thing that interested her most about that hideous strength. These issues around femininity and romance. So it seemed only proper that she join us for that. And then our other guest for that week is somebody that some of you may know. She is a big star big star. She's got 40,000 followers on Twitter. That's kind of big in our circles. And she's called Mega Verma, also kind of classical art, or it was one of her performer names. And she will be joining us too. So it promises to be a really and she's big into kind of exploring literature and art and deriving kind of articulating right-wing points of view. Maybe not as strong as some people would like, but she's very much would be at home amongst many of us. So I think that's going to be a really great panel for discussing gender and romance in that hideous strength. So it's going to be May the 6th at a slightly later time on 10 p.m. Simply because Radlib and Mrs. Radlib and Mega are in America, and it suits them better to be slightly later. So we will accommodate and do it then. So that will be the next few streams, and then after that one, I think I had suggested I might do the history and politics of modern chocolate, which sounds a bit out there, but I had a visit to the York Museum of Chocolate, and you'd be amazed at how many chocolates were developed in the UK and still are. Obviously, you've got Cadbury's in Birmingham, but then in York you have Rowntree's, which has later been bought over by Nestle, but originally Rowntree's developed the Kit Kat, the Aero, the Snickers, Smarties. You also had Terry's, so Terry's chocolate orange. They also had Terry's chocolate apple. You had the humbug. You had all these chocolates from there. So the and there's a kind of interesting set of like political aspect to it all. There's interesting kind of competition between the two, between um, Cadbury's and the rest, and how they pitch themselves to the market is quite political. So I think that's going to be, if when I get around to it, that will be a good conversation to have. But anyway, so that is the next 4/5 videos over the next wee while. So hopefully that will be. Oh yeah, and Lady Charlotte, fries cream. It's my grandmother's favorite. I believe fries was also from York. So York's a powerhouse of chocolate. Surprisingly. Any more comments or questions? This is an interesting question. I wonder if the ring actually made people invisible, or would it have been the power of the ring over others' minds that made them unable to see the wearer? It's an interesting one because in The Hobbit, so I've been reading The Hobbit recently. When Bilbo gets the ring at first, well, let me see if I can find the actual passage because it might say it better than I could myself. Let's see. It's just skimming through the bits here to find the right moment. Well, I'm not sure where exactly this is in the chapter, so I'll just summarize it. I think it basically says that it makes it so that you cannot see them except in direct sunlight, where you will see a shadow. Does it say on the next page? Because certainly the goblins spot a shadow when Bilbo's trying to squeeze through the door to get out, and so you can. So it seems that parts of you can be seen, but not the whole, not the whole person. I'm sorry, I can't be more specific, but yeah. So it is an interesting one, but certainly, like Tom doesn't get turn invisible when he wears the ring. Tom Bombadil, that is. So I don't know what that means either. It's an interesting question. I'd need to think more about it. Let's see. Yeah. Well, I think coming up to 3 hours is a good time to about stop. Uh, it's been an absolute joy to share this with you all, and I'm ever so grateful that for those of you who have uh, watched from the beginning, from for those who have joined partway through or for a bit. I'm very grateful for all of you who have contributed in the chat, uh, and also to you what do you call them, lurkers, you guys who are watching silently. I also really appreciate you guys being here too, and I also appreciate all of you who are going to be watching this back later. You all mean a lot to me, and I hope you've had a good Friday night or afternoon or Saturday morning, wherever you are, and I look forward to seeing you again soon. Oh, the Enreeb, thanks again for coming in here. Tom can see Frodo. So that does seem to imply um, that it's in the minds of other people, which is very interesting. And you could connect that to when Frodo wears the ring, he can see the ring wraiths, whereas he can't without it on. So it could be something in that as well. But yeah, thank you so much, everybody. It's been great, and God bless you all. Good night.